So I want to start by thanking the organizers very much for including me and also including Heather in our discussion today. Our job right now, by the way, my name is Carla Fehr. This is my colleague Heather Douglas. We're both from the University of Waterloo. So normally we sit beside each other in department meetings, and this is a whole new nice place. Our job today was to summarize and describe and start a discussion about what happened in the breakout sections that we were both in the last section of this workshop. And so what we'll do is I'll give a brief summary, I hope, of what Sergio and I had to say about value-laden science, and then then Heather will give a brief summary of her session. Then we'll go back and forth each in case Heather says something that sparks my interest or makes me think, which she always does, and vice versa. And then we'll open things up to discussion among the whole group. So that's the plan for today. So an interesting thing happened, which is we followed the instructions in our workshop and actually discussed the question about the relationship between science and society, how we can understand that better in order to do better science. And I'm just going to focus on one theme that came up in both of the talks. And Sergio, please jump in if you find me mischaracterizing what you had to say. And that was the importance of transparency on the influences of the knowledge, the way that we produce scientific knowledge, and on the knowledge that actually gets produced, as well as the way that knowledge flows and is disseminated among various communities and to various user groups. I started thinking about issues of transparency in the context of the epistemology of ignorance, and so the lens that I brought today was from critical race theory and feminist theory. But I hope that these concepts travel usefully and productively outside of those areas to a broader intellectual audience. So one of the reasons why the epistemology of ignorance is really interesting to me is it helps us highlight the mechanisms that tend to make our values and our interests in science invisible. So in this case, I'm not focusing on issues of the production of scientific knowledge, but I'm interested in what are the barriers that we face to doing that well. And the line that I pushed that Heather might, I'm interested to see what Heather has to say about this, is that the problem in many cases isn't that there are values in science in the first place or that there are values and interests in science per se. The problem, or a significant problem, arises when those values are there and they're invisible, when we don't know what they are, and since we don't know what they are, we are unable to critically assess them. At a community level, we're unable to have dialogue where we evaluate the usefulness of those values for our knowledge-producing goals. And this work follows quite closely from Helen Longchamp's work in critical contextual empiricism. So one of the things that I find interesting, so I do work in feminist philosophy of biology, and that's a very depressing field to work in sometimes because there is something I call the parade of the dreadfuls, and I will go quickly so I don't reproduce everything for the people in the group. But one of the things you find is knowledge produced by the best practices and the best minds of the day that are infused with values that are androcentric and sexist and coming up with, and it helps to have a really strong, dark sense of humor because that way you can fully appreciate some of the bizarre and weird things that they end up saying about women's medicine, women's biology, and sex and gender more generally. And so one of the things that I find interesting is that how can we explain this problematic research without making inferences about the characters of the scientists or about their levels of intelligence or what have you? And I think one way that we can do that is by looking not at individuals, but looking at the structures of our knowledge-producing communities. And if we look at the case of the long history of problematic work on gender, one of the reasons why I think that history can arise, or that we can have this problematic history, is because we have communities that are homogeneous. And so the values are there. We can't notice them, or members of that community can't notice them, because in some cases it would be like a fish noticing water, right? In some cases, the way that we can notice our values is in critical discussion with people who hold different ones. And so as a result, if we think about a mechanism for hiding values in science, one mechanism would be to have homogeneous scientific communities. And if we want to think about being proactive about making values visible, one of the things we can do is think about how is it that our communities are diverse. And in Canada in particular, there's lots of opportunity to improve the diversity in our scientific communities, to improve the representation of women and members of underrepresented groups in our scientific communities. And that's putting it in a positive spin, right? Opportunity for improvement. Now, turning to some of the work that Sergio was talking about, he was telling us about his work on interests in big pharma research. And there are two, or really three factors that really leapt out at me that helped me think about interests and values in science. So he talked about issues of publication planning, and this is a case where you have companies that have control over large sets of data and carefully plan and control the process by which that data is made public. And in this case, also very looking carefully at the separation between authorship and writing of papers, where you can have first drafts of papers written by interested parties and then available for editing and hence authorship by scientists. Does that sound fair, Sergio? Oh, thank you. And so again, when I think about this, what strikes me about it is issues of lack of transparency. What strikes me is in case where we have a lot of public assumptions about that knowledge-producing process. We also have scholarly assumptions about that knowledge-producing process, and those assumptions end up not holding, and we end up having a much less transparent process than we think there is. The other interesting, and I think this also fits as a parade of the horribles, is of its own, is when Sergio was talking about the importance of key opinion leaders. And in this case, we can think of those as being doctors who are paid by pharmaceutical companies to talk to doctors about their products. And so in some cases, we have what we would like to think of as an academic talk, in fact, being an academic advertisement. And this having a significant impact on prescription practices. And again, in this situation, we can think of it as a problem with issues of transparency. We can oftentimes, when in our everyday practice, when we think about what does it mean when someone is giving a talk, it's something that we think about that talk being a result of them being in charge of the message that they produce. And one of the things that struck me from Sergio's talk is that even you have cases where pharmaceutical companies will give these key opinion leaders a carousel of slides that they can then go and use to do their research. And my final point that comes from what Sergio was saying was issues of flow of information. And he really emphasized, and it really helped me to think about how we structure our knowledge production, because what he was really talking about was there being control over the development, the distribution, and the flow of huge amounts of data. And again, that control being something that's not particularly transparent. Sergio, would you like to jump in at any point here?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think that there are questions about the importance of transparency and what I was talking about too. Maybe there are lots of cases in which it's not really always central issues, and those flows are more important to the question. So in the key opinion leaders segment of my talk, I was actually just putting that as out of the question almost, the extent to which those key opinion leaders work is not transparent may or may not really affect the reception of their work.
Well, it's good that we have you in the room. So I just want to close and talk a little bit about next steps. And again, one of the things that struck me was the focus on issues of the production of knowledge and the flow of knowledge and how important that was. And issues of who is in control of both the production and the development of the message that we are trying to get out, whether we're scientists or scholars of any type, trying to talk about scientific and technological information. So with that note, I'll pass things over to Heather.
Thanks, Carla. So in our morning session talking about science and democracy, we had a great deal of focus on expertise. But to address really quickly the idea of the problem of invisible values in science, this is one reason why I think the value-free ideal has to go, so that it's legitimate to talk about values in science without being told you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. So we started with values in science because values is partly where the level of democratic accountability in science arises. So if science were in fact truly value-free, there wouldn't be issues of democracy in science and expertise assessment, democratic assessment of expertise to the extent that we have them. But because values are actually an essential part of science, both in the shaping of the direction of research and in the assessment of what counts as sufficient evidence, which brings values into the very heart of science, science isn't and indeed should not be value-free. So we have to wrap our heads around accepting value-saturated science as, in fact, ideal science. But that means also that values can't play any particular role in science. There have to be constraints on the roles values play. Otherwise, values could just override the value of evidence, which would not be good. So I talked a bit about how the values in science need to be constrained and how that actually can give us a clear sense of what counts as scientific integrity. All right, so understanding science as value-saturated, then this is me going on about the nature of science, so I tried to give an account of what science was, given that it was not certain access to the truth or value-free knowledge or anything goes, but rather an ever-developing inductive and abductive process that was always going to be endemically uncertain. But then I suggested that that endemic uncertainty was actually the reason why science could be considered robust, because the endemic uncertainty always leaves science open to empirical critique. And the fact that it's always open to empirical critique is why we should think it our best source of knowledge, presuming the backdrop of conditions for critique. And I think this is where your points about diversity in your session, and also that Frédéric was so keen to emphasize and so brilliantly emphasized in our session, is needed for robustness. So you need to have an epistemic community that values organized skepticism, as Frédéric noted, that has institutional structures like peer review, sometimes demanding statements of conflict of interest, despite the fact that they might not actually be that helpful, that you're sort of required to put it out there so that people can know what they might want to look at, how they might want to criticize it, and how having a diverse set of backgrounds at the table, including value commitments, is crucial for avoiding problems of confirmation bias. So without this sort of backdrop, we really might not value science that much after all, because you wouldn't get the epistemic robustness. So this is a really sort of important point about the nature of science in democratic societies, that the diversity is not just a political concern, it's an epistemic concern. Given that, robust, reliable knowledge is really important for democratic societies. We have all kinds of functions we need reliable knowledge for. We need it for this long, complicated list, including assessing the efficaciousness of our public policy choices, helping to inform our public policy choices, deciding responsibility in court cases, and generally challenging our preconceived views about things. That this is part of why we care about value science and fund science to the extent that we do. I also noted that you could look at science as focusing on different kinds of science within society. I argued that the basic versus applied distinction was not very helpful, that instead it was more useful to talk about public interest science, private interest science, and disciplinary interest science, and that for a democratic system, public interest science was particularly crucial because the public needs to have scientists assessing things of concern to them and of concern to the public good, both for assessing public policy effectiveness and for assessing inputs into public policy. And then finally also assessing things we might not think we need to make public policy about, namely the unintended effects of private actions that might actually end up being calls for public policy. So these are the kind of research that involves a lot of sort of perhaps background monitoring, assessments of things that might not lead to groundbreaking publications in top journals, but is crucial for informing our democratic decision-making process, and as such will generally need to be publicly funded, potentially not in the university context. I also suggested that because of the nature of public interest science, we definitely want public interest science to be made available to the public, although as Patrick emphasized with me shortly before the plenary. That's a presumed and defeasible view that at some public interest science we might actually turn out need to be kept private. For example, the recent study on a new botulism strain was the details were kept private precisely because although the discovery was clearly in the public interest and done in public interest science, the details of how to create a really nasty strain of botulism, it might not be in the public interest to have that widely available. But because of the values in science, there were clear avenues that were available for legitimately critiquing expertise, even expertise grounded potentially on diverse perspectives within expert communities. And Patrick emphasized some of these issues in particular in his talk, that the framing of the issues that experts raise often did not capture necessarily what was of interest to public concern, and that created moments where you could actually legitimately say, I'm not going to trust this expert assessment because it wasn't actually assessing the thing I actually care about, which is over here, and they need to look at this instead. And I think we heard some examples about that last night as well. And then there's also a moment where you could say, I think the expert might have framed the problem properly, but the evidence that has been so far provided is not sufficient given my concerns about what might happen if we accept a claim prematurely, or perhaps I do think the evidence is sufficient, but someone else disagrees with me because I'm concerned about not accepting a claim soon enough given what might happen. So diversity among values creates sort of diverse assessments of expertise in practice in democratic contexts, and legitimately so. So coming out of the session, I think we had some very interesting lessons on expertise. One of the things that sort of arose across the discussions was the need to have a clear understanding, not of necessarily specific scientific facts, that sort of sense of scientific literacy was overly thin and not very helpful, but a clear understanding of the nature of science. So the fact that Popular Science could, in their statement about the nature, why they were going to ban public comment, say scientific certainty is just another thing for two people to debate on television. The fact that Popular Science thought there's such a thing as scientific certainty suggests the deeply pervasively uninformed view of what science is, that in fact there is no such thing as scientific certainty. There's no fixed point that you can say, yes, now we know this for sure and forever. The history of science makes quite clear that we don't get such fixed points, despite the fact that science is our most reliable form of knowledge, that it is always open to contestation and critique. So if Popular Science expresses that view, we can imagine what it might be like across the broad array of public opinion of the nature of science, and that indeed might be partly why in sort of public controversies about science, so much of the focus ends up being about the science, rather than perhaps where it might more appropriately rest, being with the values at stake. We need to get better at talking about the values at stake in scientific controversies, of why it might be that we disagree over an assessment of evidence that we might all take on board as being the best available and the most legitimately vetted, but still disagree about what it means. And perhaps by articulating those value disputes might come to in a different area of philosophical discourse, other kinds of agreements that might then move us forward on public policy disputes. And we shouldn't wait for the facts to get clear as if then, the facts permanently settled, as if then the policy choices would be clear, because very rarely does even complete scientific agreement tell us what we should actually do in most cases, what the actual policy choices should be. If you just think, for example, about climate change, there are all kinds of different policy choices that we could be making to address reduction of carbon in the atmosphere once we even accepted the pressing needs of addressing climate change. It was also clear that we need to pay attention to the interests relevant to the objects of study. This is one of the things that Frédéric Bouchard brought up, and I guess he's left us, so he can't even correct me when I get this wrong, where he noted that experts do have interests, and that depending on the objects of study, those interests might be more or less acutely relevant to the public, and that when you have very strong interests relevant to the objects of study, you should expect more contestation of expertise, precisely because you end up with value disagreements over those objects. That the role of values in the assessment of risks and relevant expert statements is going to be ineliminable. So again, we need to get better at talking about the values, feeding on the transparency theme. And that we should use distrust to generate organized skepticism. So that the fact that we are now in sort of a cultural regime of distrust and skepticism about expertise specifically, although clearly not generally, given Sheila's data this morning, Frederic suggested that could be utilized to sort of generate some of the organized skepticism that is so useful for assuring robustness. And then again, to try to get better at talking about not just values perhaps, but also general worldviews that frame the very problems we're thinking about in ways that might move us forward on some of these public controversies. So if you are an expert, what are some take-home lessons about what you should do? A whole list of new things that maybe you should do. One is being open to challenges and explain the reasons you have for the views you have, that this will help solidify both the claim to expertise, but also engage in public discourse in a more transparent way. Being clear about the evidence that informs your view, being clear about the limits of your expertise, clearly explicating uncertainties, not trying to necessarily eliminate them because they are always going to be there, but explicating where they lie and where they arise, being clear about the values used to make judgments, helping to develop alternative scenarios or options for policy making, and reinforcing the mechanisms of organized skepticism that reinforce the robustness of scientific practices. So what have we learned? This might be getting repetitive, but perhaps it's useful to go over again. Science is important for making decisions in a democratic society, so we care about science. We want to have science as part of our society. But science is neither infallible nor value-free. The uncertainties that rest with science are ineliminable, and decisions have to be made in the face of that. Scientific expertise is legitimately contestable in a number of ways, including on the framing of problems and in the assessments of the sufficiency of evidence. Scientific communities have to be allowed to speak freely and pursue evidence freely within ethical constraints, which is a different talk, and perhaps meeting altogether if we're going to assure robustness. And diversity and dissent should be harnessed to support the organized skepticism that ensures robustness. But we did not address a whole bunch of things. And I think this might perhaps be useful for thinking as we go forward in our sessions. How can we ensure, for example, that science in the public interest and access to it is adequately supported? How can we ensure that the scientific community has the social institutions to ensure epistemic robustness, that those institutions aren't being undermined and that they're functioning well? How can we enable experts in the public to engage in productive discourse? What kinds of social fora might work for enabling the kinds of challenges and discussion between experts and the citizens that they are presumably hoping to inform, or policymakers they're hoping to inform, so that the range of issues that I've been talking about get adequately represented, aired, and addressed. And what institutions can support appropriate representation of citizen interest in science? So if you don't think getting the experts in the public together directly is going to work, that we need other kinds of institutional modes, how can you ensure appropriate democratic representation of the values that are going to be part of the scientific discussion? So that's where we left. That's where I'm leaving things now, I should say.
I'll just say three more things because I'm actually curious to have discussion as well with the broader group. So one of the things that struck me when Heather was talking is that the session on science and democracy talked a lot about values, and the session on science and values talked a lot about things that are fundamental to democracy. And so, not surprising but interesting, these two things come together. And so when Heather told us sort of the reported or exhorted that science is not value-free, but we need to think critically about the particular role that values play, both in the creation of scientific knowledge and in terms of how we use those values in policy. One of the ways that we can think about that is to look at the structures of our epistemic communities. And I just took notes furiously sometimes as she was talking about the importance of the conditions of diversity in our communities, and also the fact, and this might be putting words in your mouth, and so maybe it's just something that I'm thinking about after Heather thought, was that our epistemic concerns and our ethical concerns are really deeply intertwined. So doing good science, part of that means having a social structure that does that science that is politically and ethically informed and engaged, but also that doing good science in itself is an ethical good, right? When we look at, so if we talk about producing rigorous scientific knowledge as an epistemic question, that's also an ethical question, because that knowledge has intrinsic value for itself, but it's something that's crucial to solving social problems that are looming large and before us all the time. And so finally, one of the things that struck me, linking what Heather was saying to issues of transparency, was one thing that came up when we talked about, that came up for me when we talked about individual scientists and scientific institutions, or another way of thinking about this, were to think about what is involved in being someone who must trust experts or some of these institutions, and reciprocally, what is involved for those institutions to be trustworthy. And so responsible trusting versus and being worthy of that responsible trust. And when we think about that, we think about issues of scientific integrity, and we also think about issues of properly organized scientific institutions.
So thank you, Carla, because that actually reminded me that I forgot to mention one thing that Frédéric talked about quite a bit, which was that expertise is essentially an asymmetric epistemic situation that requires something to engender trust. And he spoke about some of the failed theories around trust, like the moral theory of expertise and the purely epistemic theory of expertise. And that's what pushed him to think about organized skepticism as being the basis for trustworthiness. But I also want to implore us, I think it's quite a quite useful metaphor to think about the epistemic and the ethical as intertwined. I want to implore us to also to keep in mind that the political is not necessarily identical with the ethical. It's a mistake that a lot of, I used to make this mistake a lot. I still make the mistake a lot, I'm sure, that I confuse the ethical with the political, but in fact the political and the ethical are very often distinct, and it's quite useful to think of them as, the political being about how do we manage competing interests in a collective society well, whereas the ethical can focus rather instead on our sort of moral concerns, and while those might overlap, they aren't identical. And I think the metaphor of the intertwining of these things is really important, because although Yves in our discussion mentioned the metaphor of cake, where you have ingredients that get mixed together, and once they're mixed and baked, you can't really pull them apart again. And one of the things I think is more useful for our purposes is to think of the metaphor of a weaving, where, in fact, when you have a tapestry, the threads become so combined that might be difficult to pull apart. But as intellectuals, we are capable of pulling them apart if we so choose, and then knitting them back together again, perhaps in a different pattern. And that might be a more useful metaphor for us going forward than cake. Although
But
cake
is good.
Cake is good. Okay, let's open the floor.